All right, so in this video, what we're gonna do is go back to the very basics and see how we can model a coffee mug. Now, you may be wondering why you would want to model something like a coffee mug when there are coffee mugs in the asset browser and available on other online model websites for free, but there are a lot of tools and techniques you can learn when it comes to modeling from making something even something as basic as a coffee mug. So I'm gonna go over a couple of different approaches here. I'll be honest, I did not realize how long it was going to take me to get through both of these techniques. So there's a lot of information here. Hopefully you enjoy it, and let's get started. All right, so let's get started modeling a coffee mug. Now, as I mentioned, it may seem pretty basic, but there are a lot of important techniques you can take from being able to model a coffee mug and apply it to more complex models, as I'll point out. So I'm actually going to use a coffee mug from the asset browser here. We can just drag it in. Really it's no different than using an image for reference. In fact, I do like it better because you can see the topology of an object. So I do think it's a great way to practice when it comes to simple objects, and if you're just starting out learning 3D. Now, one of the things I don't necessarily like about this coffee mug is the handle. I think there's probably some other coffee mugs that have a little bit more of a traditional handle, something like that. But really kind of it's up to you, all right, in terms of which approach you take to the handle. And that's what's nice, like I said, about working with, reference, whether it is a 3D object or an image, you can always kind of do your own thing if you don't like the image you're working with here. So let's just move these off to the side. And what we're going to do is start with a cylinder. Now, this first technique is really going to be kind of a bit simpler approach where we work with kind of the volume builder. So we can create each part individually and then use the volume builder to kind of place it and join them together. So I'm going to start by just going into a side view here, maybe getting rid of that second coffee mug by setting both stoplights to red. I just switched to the right view here, either by using my F keys, or you can do it by clicking the button in the top right hand corner here to toggle your active view. So back to the right view, F3 it is, and I'm just trying to size this about the same that we see. And I don't have to get this perfect. I'm going to be able to make adjustments later a couple of different ways, but still it helps. So I'm going to just use my scale tool, that's T on the keyboard, and I'm just scaling it uniformly, larger or smaller. When an object is a primitive, you can't adjust the size on an individual axis. It does need to be an editable object for that. So what we can do though, because this is a primitive object in the object tab, is adjust the radius until we're happy with it. So even something like this is pretty close, and we can use, say, an FFD here shortly to kind of finish making it a little bit closer. But honestly, from just eyeballing it, the tops here look very similar. Now at this point, what we want to do is consider how many segments we're going to need. And this might be a little bit more important if we were trying to do it all as one piece. But since we are going to do it as two separate pieces, that isn't something I'm quite as concerned about. Now, for the rotation segments, I do want something that would smooth easily in well if we place it inside a subdivision surface, which if I have my cylinder selected, hold down Alt, I can click on a subdivision surface and it will make the cylinder a child of it. So really, we could go as low as 8 here, but I think 16 will work just fine. All right, for the height segments, if we look at our other mug here, you'll see that they're maybe not quite as uniform or evenly spaced as what our cylinder currently is. And that's because this was set up to work with, subdivision surface. And so there's edges closer to the top to help that retain shape. Same with the bottom. And they're a little bit more spaced out towards the middle, which is really what you want with subdivision surface to kind of maximize and make sure we're working as efficiently as possible. For our purposes, we may just bump this up to say 6 and then go from there. What I'm going to do now is create an FFD deformer by coming here to my deformers. If I hold Shift with the cylinder selected, it will make the FFD a child of the cylinder and automatically fit it to parent. If for whatever reason you don't remember to hold Shift or the cylinder object isn't selected, you can just create an FFD, make it a child of the cylinder, and hit Fit to Parent. All right, and really what we have here are grid points in each dimension, total of 3, that will allow us to kind of shape this and round and curve it out to better match our coffee mug. So going to the side here can help. It can be a bit confusing seeing both objects, but it'll make a little bit more sense, I think, as we start working with our points and scaling them. So I will go into point mode. I do have the FFD selected. I'm going to switch to my rectangle selection tool and just drag a large selection around the top here to get those 3 points. And now what I can do is kind of scale this out so that it matches the width of the other coffee mug. And I'm just going to repeat that process. I hit spacebar to toggle tools back to my rectangle selection. I can then just drag out a selection again, hit T to switch to scale, and kind of scale it so it matches. Once again, spacebar to toggle to my previous tool, which in this case was rectangle selection. Drag another selection box around the bottom set of points. I could hit spacebar again to toggle back to scale, or I could just hit T and we'll scale this in. You can see it kind of tapering a little bit. And if I do want to lower this to kind of match our reference, fine. But I mean, look, we moved that 0.1 centimeters, so it's not all that much. And you can see we do end up with a curve that is pretty similar to the coffee mug on the left. You could turn subdivision surface on to see that a little bit more. All right, if you wanted, you could also add more height segments here, and that could help kind of match the curve. But overall, I think that looks pretty good. I want to check that middle point though, actually. I think that may need just a little bit more adjustment. Yeah, just scale it out just a little bit more. And there we go. So that's looking pretty good. All right, now we've gone about as far as we can with this cylinder as a primitive. So what we're going to do is right click on it and do current state to object. And that creates a collapsed version of our cylinder and FFD into an editable object. And what I can do is take my original cylinder with FFD, put it in a null, and then hide it. So that way, for whatever reason I want to go back, I have that option. And so with this, what we can do, go into polygon mode, because I'm going to want to go back into rectangle selection to select all the top polygons and delete them. And you'll notice if we look from a side view here, so I hit F4 to go to our front view, there is some thickness. And then on the bottom, there's a little bit of a dome there. So you can see that. And we can add that dome in pretty quickly by switching to polygon mode, brush selection to select all those polygons. I'm going to go right click, inset, click and drag. You can see we can do something like that. And then we can next choose extrude. And that will allow us to click and drag and extrude this up. And if we wanted to make it a little bit smaller, switch to our scale tool, scale it in. I probably extruded it a bit too far up, so I can move this down. I, of course, could look at this from the right view by using F3, saying, oh, maybe something like that. Looks a little bit better, and in fact, we could have just used our bevel tool to do that, but I personally just do this out of habit, not because it's any better or anything like that. In fact, it's probably less efficient. All right, once again, double checking with our subdivision surface, we can see it smooths it out pretty well. We may want to add a helper edge or two to just make it a little bit flatter at the bottom so it's not quite as curved. And then also deal with some of the triangulation issues we're getting where all the points of those triangles meet. So that's going to be the easiest thing to fix. I can right click and do loop path and cut, and then just create a loop cut pretty close to where all those meet. And all it does is really make that smaller, which is going to be good enough. Keep in mind, this is on the bottom. We may not even see it anyway. And probably don't have to model it. Now for these helper edges, I've done a whole separate video on subdivision surface, but the closer these are to a corner, the more it's going to define that corner and give us a less round, a harder edge. So, how hard of an edge we want is really kind of up to us. I think just kind of cutting somewhere close to say 50% on the flat part on the bottom is going to be good enough. But we could also do one on each side here of these corners to make that even more pronounced. But like I said, I think that's going to be good just the way we have it. Because once again, it's on the bottom. Oops, not as concerned about that. So great, we have the outside of our coffee mug done. Now we need to do the inside. Now, if we were trying to do this quick, switch to my right view again, actually front view F4, we could probably get away with using the thicken generator, which if we create and then place our cylinder inside, well, the values it's using are a bit too large, but we could turn this way down, maybe something like 0.1, actually a little bit larger than that, perhaps 0.3. And that's going to give us some thickness, which once again, if we switch to like a front view, we can actually see. The problem with this is that it does also give us kind of that domed top up here. Now that would be pretty easy to fix. And while our thickness is a little bit off compared to our reference, maybe we'd go as high as say 0.5, you know, we would still need to do some work after. So this could work. All right, it actually looks pretty good, but it's something we may just want to model ourselves. And that's what the approach I'm going to take here, though this one is working pretty well. So I'm going to get rid of the thicken. And what I'm going to do is select my cylinder, go into edge mode here, and I'm going to select this top loop. I can do that by hitting U and then L. For the shortcut key, that will select this top loop. And there's a way to extrude selections of edges if you're in one of your move, rotate, or scale tools. So if I switch to scale, hold Control, and then click and drag, I'm essentially extruding these edges in. And so I can determine how thick I want the coffee mug to be, maybe something like that. Could once again just look at this one to judge it and see we got pretty close. Once I've extruded those edges in, I can adjust this a little bit if I want to, just by scaling it, not holding Control. And now what I will do is switch to a front view again, because what I'm going to do is extrude this down, matching the segments here, and then also kind of matching the angle we have. And I did that once again using that same technique. I'm in my move tool this time. I'm going to hold Control, and I can click and drag on an individual axis like the Y to extrude just these edges down. And I'm going to line it up with my existing edge loop. And just so we can see, F1 for perspective, what that's doing, back to our front view, F4. And I'm just going to repeat this process, holding Control, moving this down on the Y. And then as you know, the angle changes here, as our shape tapers in, I'm going to do that as well. I'll switch to my scale tool and just scale these edges in till they match pretty closely. That looks pretty good. Switch to my move tool, hold Control, pull this down till the next edge loop. See, I need to taper this in, so I'll scale it. And I'm just going to repeat that pretty much all the way down. So I'm gonna go a little bit faster now. Control, pull down on the Y, scale in, back to my move tool, Control, pull it down, scale in. You can see this is a pretty quick way of creating a lot of edges, extruding them, and not having to go through kind of the extrude command. So once I get to this last one, I'm going to stop right above kind of the domed bottom we made, and just kind of stop it right there. So maybe do something like this. You'll notice now in a top view, or perspective view, I should say, we still have kind of an open part there we need to close, and we can use close polygon hole for that. So I'll just hover over one of the edges that make up that opening. It can be a little bit hard to see if we're not used to working a lot in 3D, but clicked on it, it filled it in. And if I was to turn my subdivision surface back on, you'd see we have that same issue with the triangulation there. So all I'm going to do is just inset this polygon similar to what we did before. So I'll select it, right click, click and drag until we get something kind of small. And that just kind of makes that triangulation a lot smaller. And now we have the outside of our coffee mug, and it looks pretty good. Maybe we want a little bit of a helper edge here on the top to kind of keep this a little flatter. So I'll switch to edge mode, right click, choose loop path, and just kind of like we did before, just close to the middle. And if it's not as close as you would like, you can come here into the actual settings for your loop path cut tool and set the % to 50, and that will place it evenly. And with that, I think we're officially done there. Now for the handle, as I said, there's quite a few approaches we can take with this. If we wanted to try and match this handle, or we wanted to make our own, I guess I can kind of make my own here, because essentially it's just a torus. So what I would do is create a torus. All right, and the default torus is pretty large considering. I'm going to scale this down. All right, just by switching to my scale tool and clicking off of it to scale uniformly. If I click, I guess that's just a habit if you're working with a primitive object, because as I said previously, doing on an individual axis won't, but if the object was editable, it would. So want to be careful of that. And I don't want to make this editable quite yet. So what I'm going to do is move this and then come in here and continue to scale it. Okay, and try and get it something a little bit closer to that. So I'm going to want the ring radius to be a lot thinner, and I may have to start typing in values here to get something a little bit less. I'm also going to want fewer ring segments. Once again, just trying to match what they have. I could count them. I don't want to do that, so maybe something like 12 works pretty good. Pipe segments, we can turn down those really low as well. Once again, subdivision surface going to help with that. And then from here, I could use another FFD to help with this. So FFD, make it a child. I didn't do the previous method of using shift. And so I can just kind of work with this until I get something that replicates what we're seeing over there. And I might have wanted to add a couple more segments to this of the FFD to help me approximate this shape. But what I can do instead, well, to fix that is just go back to before I move the FFD and maybe add like one more. And I think this is another important part if you're modeling from like using an existing model is, you know what, I can just pull this right here and then go into a view and match it even better. And this is where maybe I don't want an FFD at all, because I could very easily just kind of match the segments. And the advantage of that, rather than using an FFD, is I'm going to get a little bit more practice pushing and pulling points, which there's no replacement for that in 3D. It's just something you need to do and spend some time doing. So it's never a bad idea to do that. All right, so maybe we do something like this. And that's looking pretty good for the time being. Once again, I could always make this editable, push and pull those points, and perhaps I'll do that a bit. But yeah, that's not too far off. We have a different number of segments, which would make this a little bit tricky. But overall, I'm pretty happy with the overall shape. The thickness, though, at least here, definitely needs some work. So I can use the FFD to help. I'm going to hit F2 to go to the top view here. Select just this top row, and then do something like that to kind of match the thickness. Oops, a little bit more. Make sure you have the torus selected. I can move it. It looks pretty good. So we'll move this back to our coffee cup. And there we go. Maybe move this down just a touch. Awesome. So that looks pretty good. I don't like the fact that it's kind of cutting through here, right? And that's where we would have to probably go and make this editable and slice it. So that looks pretty good to me. So I think I'm going to do just that. I'm going to do current state to object. Take the torus, drop it in our OG, original geometry, so we can delete it. Go to a side view here or a front view. Go into polygon mode. I guess it doesn't matter. We can do this in several different modes, but it's going to be a little tricky because I'm going to want this cut to, you know, kind of curve a little bit. And so I may just do like a line cut, and I'm going to uncheck visible only, and then just kind of go something like this. And then I'm not really cutting through anything here. I'm just trying to do it so I can get up there. Yeah, we have those cutting through. I may want to undo it because I do think we're going to want to give ourselves a little bit of extra room to play with. Also, this surface is curved, so if I'm not careful, right, the cut could be on the outside, and we want it to be just on the inside, really inside the thickness here. We may have done it a little bit too close, right? Like right there, we'll see. Can always just move it a bit if necessary. So now what I should be able to do is come into my polygon tools here. Polygon mode, I should say. Select the polygons that are on the inside. And then delete them. All right, got just about all of them. We should know if we have any issues when we use the volume builder here very shortly. But all right, that's looking pretty good. What I can do now is take both of my elements, and I'm not going to use the subdivision surface, at least I don't think so, in to a volume builder. So I'll place both of them in there. Okay, now what I'm going to need to do with this volume builder is lower the voxel size dramatically. So you can see we're getting something that looks a lot more like what we had before. And I'll put this into a volume mesher just to kind of see the end result. All right, and what do you know? We lost our handle. So let's see what we can do to try and get that back. There we go. Just had to increase the voxel range a little bit, maybe something like 70%. And I'm not too worried about kind of everything being low poly with this, as we'll see here, we're not quite done. What I'm going to do with this volume mesher is now stick it into a remesh. With a bit of luck, that's going to clean up our geometry and hopefully get us something that's a lot closer to what we have here. Now, the problem with the remesh is it didn't want to get rid of polygons, but it did clean things up for the most part, not 100% perfect. I suspect we had a gap there, which maybe we'll go in and fix. But for the mesh density, I'm going to set it to like 5%. So that way, we know. Oops. Oh. We can hopefully go back to something closer to what we have here. It's actually taking a little bit longer than I expected. And we can see this is actually working surprisingly well. All right, it's one of the things I like about the remesher. And in fact, the remesher, we could even go lower with this density. But I think before that, I do want to just double check that point there. Oh, and there's our problem. We actually don't have that polygon at all. So I can just solo this object. We can see, it's just not there. We can try close polygon hole. I'm not sure it will work since there was just a little edge there, but it looks like it did. Anything else? That looks good. This is a bit problematic with those triangles, I guess. But since we're doing all this, not too big of a deal. And actually, let's just take this down a little bit lower, maybe to say 2%. And with that, I think we're just about good. The idea here is that we've created this polygon object that, if necessary, could still be put into a subdivision surface and smooth out and clean up a little bit better. But without it, we still end up with something that is, if I unsolo this, pretty close to what we have on the left here. And so with that, I think we're just about done with this technique when it comes to modeling a coffee mug. All right, so now what we're going to do is model this coffee mug just using polygon objects and polygon tools. We may use one deformer, but aside from that, we're going to just kind of do this, brute force like. So I'm going to start with a cylinder. I'll be going a little bit faster here since it's very similar to what we just saw. And I'm going to size this cylinder similar to what we had with the others. So I can do something like this for the height, for the width, come in here and adjust the radius, something like that. I got lucky, and you can type in values in here, 4.1, 3.9, if you need to do that in order to make them kind of match. Okay, I am going to pay more attention to my rotation segments and height segments here because I'm going to have to place edge loops where I want to create my handle from. In the previous example, we just kind of mashed two objects together. But if we're going to try and do this as a continuous polygon object, we have to plan where we're going to be able to create the handle from. And so that's why this is a more complex technique here and something that is a little bit more involved. So rotation segments, I'll bump these up to 20, okay, which is just going to give me a little bit more roundness, make it a little bit easier perhaps to work with those handles. And for the height segments, I will set this to 6. Okay, I'm going to make this editable. And I still am going to use the FFD like I did before. I think there's a lot of good reasons to learn how to kind of bend points by just kind of scaling them in row by row like this in order to create kind of the tapered shape you want. All right, I do realize this is a little bit shorter than the other cups at the moment. But that being said, I still think it's easier to use an FFD for this, and there's no reason why we shouldn't, okay? So I'm gonna hold down Shift, create an FFD that will make it a child. And now what I can do is, just like we did previously, make sure we're in point mode, select these points, and curve our mug to match our reference, our previous examples. If I need to pull these up a little bit, up or down to kind of match the height of the others, we can do that as well. Keeping an eye on that middle one, make sure it kind of lines up, and there we go. Now, a really important reason why I wanted to use the FFD here was so I could add the edge loops I want for my handle and have it not affect the curve we are getting. And I'll kind of show what I mean by that. But what I could do is take this edge loop now and kind of move it up to where I need for the top of my handle. All right, maybe that's a little bit too aggressive, but maybe something like right there. And then I can add another one towards the bottom where I want the handle to stop. So we'll probably have like 2 polygons like this on one of the sides for the handle. Likewise down here, could maybe move this edge loop up a bit. Make sure I got all of them selected. I did. And I'll add one more down here for the bottom. Trying to make these 2 polygons about the same height as these 2. Okay. And so now, once we get out of sub-object mode here and back to model mode, we can see that it's still curved and it's still taking into consideration the edges we just added. All right. So what I'll do is a current state to object, take that one, place it in our OG null. We don't need that. And now we have this curved. And so what I was saying before is if you just were to add an edge loop, it's not going to have any tension. You can come into the shaping here, and sometimes this shaping helps. I was experimenting with it earlier. It's a little bit tricky though to get it exactly the way you want. So when possible, I would recommend, does not want to get rid of that edge loop now. There we go. To add segments while still using deformers before using a current state to object. All right, from here, we can now start to work with the handle. And we'll just kind of do it on this side. I want to make sure I pick, 2 polygons here, 2 polygons there that are kind of on the top, right? That are ideally aligned with one of our axes. The X could work, the Z could work as well. Okay, now these right now are perhaps a bit wide, at least compared to our reference, though there are some coffee mugs where this, the handle is, thinner. Okay, so I'll try and kind of do a hybrid approach where it's similar, thinner like this, perhaps, but still has some curve to it. Though once again, every coffee cup is different. And what I'm going to do here is inset this, which will give me a little bit more room to play with. I want to be very careful with this inset though, because just like when you add additional edge loops to a curved surface, you can really screw up your surface here if you start pushing and pulling these points. It will no longer be like a uniform curve. And we'll see that here because we're going to do a little bit more with this. Okay, what I'm going to do is add an edge loop. All right, and yeah, we can just add it right here. So I'll do something like right there. And I was really hoping it would tell me, give me there it is, options to do 50% here. All right. And this is what I said to be aware of before. So actually I take it back. We won't do that all the way around. We can kind of cheat it by just using this selection. So I'll insert loop, make sure our offset is about 50%. I had a pretty good guess there. And that should have just, restrict to selection was not selected there. So make sure that's turned on. Now when I come back here and do it, it will only do it on the selected polygon. So I'll set that to 50%. Same thing here, 50%. And I want to double check as I'm going through here. I'm not adding any polygons. I don't want them, especially with like a line cut. But yeah, that looks pretty good. And this is creating some n-gons, right? So I don't want to, do that. That's not usually a good thing. And, we can see if we put this in a subdivision surface, it actually looks okay. But, things are subdividing pretty well, maybe a little bit of a hard edge there. But if we turn off the shading, do we have any shading issues? And I don't know how well this is going to come through, on a compressed YouTube video, but there's a little bit of a flattening area right there. And that can be really hard to fix. We could spend a bunch of time talking about topology and how to fix that. N-gons can cause shading issues, but what I want to do is just kind of look at this polygon from like a top view and just kind of see how things look. And I can see that, it looks pretty good. I maybe could just pull this out just a bit. But if I'm not careful and I pull this out too far, it'll start to kind of bulge. And maybe that's, what we want to avoid that issue where we're getting that shading. Is just make it so kind of pronounced that it's intentional instead of it trying to look perfectly smooth. So that might not actually be a bad idea. Okay. What I can do now is maybe round this out a little bit. And the way we can do that is by selecting the four corners here. All right, switching to scale and scaling these in. And I'm trying to keep an eye on how much I scale these in so I can do it to the next one. I think around 80% looks good. So we'll do that here. Do 80%. Once again, I probably should have spent a bit more time making these the same size. They don't appear to be quite the same size, but not the end of the world. And really now it's just about extruding this and making it smooth and rounded. What I'm actually going to do here is delete these because if I try to extrude them, you'll see it kind of changes the size of them. They get larger as we extrude them. And so I'll use that same technique as before, where I go into loop selection, UL, make sure I'm in edge selection, select an edge loop. Maybe kind of have to do both of them there because switch to our move tool. And I can just pull this out. All right, can pull this out. I'm going to flatten it by switching to my Z position and just kind of scaling it until it's flat. The way to see if it's perfectly flat would be to open up your coordinate manager and check the value on the x-axis. I can see that 0 centimeters. I'm going to do something very similar down here. All right, loop, select both loops, and switch to my move tool, hold control, move this out. I could also just come in here and set this to 0, and that will also straighten it out. Now, I may not want, this hard of an edge here. So that's something for us to consider. We can see how it smooths out with our subdivision surface, see what our polygons look like. That's where our triangles are. There are definitely ways to avoid having triangles there. Having that edge go all the way around could potentially help with that. All right, now I think we lost our chance of, no, maybe not. Adding in our edge loop, we can see what that would look like if it would improve kind of the way this triangulates or subdivides, I should say. And I think it will, but not all that much, okay? So it stops the triangulation there, but shading wise, it looks about the same. And we could end up with a little bit of weird flattening there, which I'm not seeing a whole lot of. Oh, we got a little bit of an issue there somehow, right? Yep. So that's why we want to keep an eye on things as we're moving. Sometimes you loop, path cut, all of that stuff before. Now, I'm guessing there's an extra point or something there. So what I can do is just select it and hit dissolve. And that made things immediately worse. So we can just line cut it back. I want to make sure visible only is checked here. It's probably what's causing some of my issues. I believe I turned that off previously. So let's see what we get now. Much better. All right, so that's looking a little bit better, right? That extra edge loop, which I guess I'm kind of stuck with now, even though it's kind of flattening things out. If I really wanted to get rid of it, what I could do is let's turn off subdivision surface, select my edge loop one more time, and then just deselect these edges by holding Control, right? And then dissolving again. All right, another way of doing this would just be to add an edge loop around here, which perhaps I can show at the very end. But at this point, we're kind of in the home stretch here with the handle. What I would do is select the edge loop, however you do it, V. If you then go to select in loop, you could do UL. Oops, I got out of the edge loop. It's going to select it. It is. And what I'm going to do is try to go to like a side view here, and I can maybe use the grid a bit to help make sure everything's lined up a little bit more evenly. We could also just select both and zero them out on the X, similar to what we did with just these. But what I'm going to do is hold Control again, rotate this out, and I'm going to rotate it 45 degrees. Right, it's 45, get as close as I can. If I'm a little bit off, that's fine. Move this down a little bit. And we can even, once again, use the grid perhaps to help with this. And I'm going to do the same thing to our edge loop here. All right, make sure I move this back here. Hold Control, rotate it 45 degrees. And then move it up. Let's see, was it there? Looks like about there. Yeah. And I'll finish this one off. Just hold Control again. Maybe rotate it to like right here. And rotate it the other 45 so that it's perfectly flat. Once again, if I want to zero this out on the X just to make sure, I absolutely can, except that did not work because I guess we want Y to is almost flat. So do that. And then we just kind of need to do the same thing to the part up here. All right, so we have that. Can do that, rotate it, pull this down, and now we just need to join these together. And like I said, it would be nice if they were the same size, but they're not. In fact, it might be a little bit easier to like move one up, so that way we can just weld, you know, to one, right? So if you want to join 2 points together, make sure you're in point mode. All right, let's go to weld, which is right there. And you can see you can weld to this point, the middle, or the bottom. I'm just going to choose the bottom one because that one I spent a little bit more time positioning. So I'm just going to go through making sure I select corresponding edges and select and weld them. Okay. Well, I think that one didn't quite work. And there we go. Now the size wasn't quite the same, so it is getting a little bit smaller as it goes to there. That's fine. There's also a little bit of a change in size as we rotate it. And so, you know, we could come in and try and work with that, you know, by scaling this up or down to try and make it as consistent as possible. It almost looks like it needs to come down a little bit, but, you know, I wouldn't worry too much about that right now. And so at this point, we have a pretty round handle. If we use our subdivision surface, we can see it rounds out pretty well. Like I said, we may not want this edge loop here, right? So we could see what that looks like without it. Select it. So we want to do it in edges. Edge, dissolve. We get a little bit of a nice transition there in the thickness of our handle. Not sure I like that. So, you know, the other option would be to just manually kind of straighten this out and then scale this up until we get something that's a little bit more gradual and really just kind of the Y there, right? So the more smooth that transition is, the more smooth that will be. And you could also play with the curve now, right? Because I don't think we did a perfect job with this curve. not by any means. We could just come in here. This probably should be moved up a little bit. So now it's kind of a little bit more regular, just like we did to the top one. We could flatten this out. Oops, I got this top point I don't want, so I'll deselect that. But flatten this, scale this up a little bit. And that's going to give us a little bit more of a uniform round look to our coffee mug. And with that, I think we're done with this approach. Okay. You know, I didn't focus too much on the inside here because it's the exact same as before. Okay. I can just delete these polygons and, you know, go through and do exactly what I did for the inside with our previous approach. Same with the bottom as well. And with the way we did this, it would work pretty good in a subdivision surface, right? As I've kind of toggled on before. But something else you could do if you really wanted to round this out a little bit without using a subdivision surface is you could select all these edge loops that are right here. And I wonder what happens if we bevel these. We can get something that's almost, and actually if we just kind of extend it so they kind of overlap, we get something that rounds out pretty darn well without having to manually do that ourselves. That being said, you know, I do think it's a good idea to know how to do this ourselves. And if you wanted to practice that, what I would do is say, all right, I'm going to add, say, an edge loop here, and then select the points, come in and round it out. And if once again, that means we need to kind of work with the size a little bit, so be it. You know, scaling it up or down, I do think it tends to get like a little bit larger here, kind of towards the middle. Maybe that's good. Maybe that will give the coffee mug a little bit more durability, but that's kind of the approach you can take to help rounding it out. You know, maybe we want to adjust the rotation here, trying to make it even. You know, really it should still be, let's see if I can try and draw what I'm talking about with this type of thing. Where's the doodle, you know, pretty divided equally here, right? So that's kind of what you're going for when you add in those additional edge loops. So that's what I would keep in mind. And look, you want to do the math to figure out those angles, be my guest. But as this is a coffee cup, you know, it's not the end of the world if things are perhaps a little bit off, because based on how far we see it, you know, it may not be noticeable. Last thing I would do is double check any of your Phong shading, right? Because I think on this one, we do get some weirdness on the handle here. That could just be a Phong issue, right? And usually turning on subdivision surface will kind of show that. Maybe a little bit of a thick handle too. You can also take a look at your topography. Do you see any kind of weirdness? All right, interesting that this one is splitting there, whereas that one isn't. Aha, it's because of those edges. All right, so I'd get rid of those. And if you need to address the Phong shading, you can do that by just kind of turning this up or down a little bit, or even going in and selecting individual edges and breaking the shading there. All right, but getting too much into that is perhaps a bit more than I would like to cover in this video, as it's already starting to get pretty long for just a single coffee mug. And so that will do it for this one. If there's anything else you would like to see, please leave me a comment down below. And if you found this video helpful, I'd appreciate it if you could like it and subscribe to my channel. Until next time, take care.